You ready, Chris? Okay, good morning. At this time, I will call to order the Meridian Districting Committee for the purpose of the scheduled public hearing to receive input on the proposed districting map. For the record, it is 10:02 a.m. on Friday, May 20th. May I please have the clerk call roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Jagosh. Mr. Nesmith.
Present.
Mr. Corey.
Present.
Mr. Steed.
Present.
Ms. Larson.
Here.
Ms. Greer.
Present. May I get a motion to adopt the agenda?
Madam Chair, I move to adopt the agenda as presented.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. The agenda is adopted. Mr. Starman, would you take a moment to please provide a brief overview of the process up to this point and our purposes here today?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. So I know you've heard much of this in previous meetings, but I'm going to recap some of our prior conversations, both to kind of prime the pump for today, but also for the benefit of our audience, both here in the chambers, as well as those that might be looking or watching the meeting via Zoom, or they might watch the meeting at another time once it's recorded. So I'll cover some material that you've heard before, but it's probably a good refresher for everybody, and I think it would be helpful for the public as well. So I'll start by discussing there was a new, it's not as new any longer, but a law was adopted by the state legislature in 2020 that was subsequently codified as Idaho Code Section 50-707A. And that is our reason for being here today. So that state statute essentially said that for those cities, incorporated cities that have 100,000 or more inhabitants, that there now is a requirement, state requirement, that districts be established. And so as of the 2020 census, Meridian falls into that category. There are only 3 cities in Idaho currently that meet that threshold. So Boise City, Nampa, and Meridian are the 3 cities that are impacted today, and that's likely will change going forward, but today is the 3. So that's our purpose for being here today, is to assist the mayor and city council with its statutory obligation to create districts for city council elections on a going forward basis. In response to the state statute, the City Council adopted a Meridian ordinance that modified the Meridian City Code to help provide some structure. The state law is fairly brief, doesn't really provides the skeleton, but not a lot of meat on the bones. And so the one purpose of the Meridian ordinance was to flesh out some of these concepts and ideas in a little bit more detail, but also importantly, the city council and the mayor felt strongly that it was important to encourage citizen involvement and to make sure we have a fair and objective process. And so it's not a requirement of state law that we have, that the city council or the city establish a committee or have public hearings or anything of that nature. That's those are all sort of tools that the city council adopted in order to encourage maximum citizen input, to make sure we had smart people like you all that would assist the city council and the city in establishing those districts, and that we have plenty of opportunity for citizen input. So the city council adopted an ordinance that created the Meridian Districting Committee, and I thank you once again for agreeing to serve on the committee. We really appreciate your public service. I know you all have busy lives and other duties, so thank you for doing so. It's greatly appreciated by the mayor and by the city council. So we adopted an ordinance, the city council adopted an ordinance that created this committee and defined its duties and obligations and sort of the parameters of how all this would work. So I'll just briefly touch on some of those items. So this is a 6-member committee. The membership was members were selected by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. And essentially the charge of this committee is to establish 6 city council districts and then to number those districts and to assign council seats to each district accordingly. And then I'll talk in a moment about some of the parameters that we have to be mindful of, but your core duty is to essentially generate a proposed Meridian districting plan the heart of which is a map of the city that would divide the city into 6 districts. And starting in 2023, with the next city general election, elections will start, council members will be elected by the electorate from those particular districts. Just as a sidebar, I'll mention that we think it's important. The state law does not really address this topic, but we think it's important to maintain staggered terms for the city council. And so the way it works is that we have 3 seats that will be up for election in 2023. Those will be elected by districts. And then in 2025, the remaining 3 seats would be elected by district. So we'll continue to have staggered terms even with this transition to districts. Importantly, I think, we've talked about this, is that the city council and the mayor felt very strongly that this committee should act independently and autonomously. And so that was actually incorporated into the ordinance, and the ordinance talks about the fact that this committee will act independently without regard to the residency of current elected officials or potential candidates. That ought not be part of your deliberation or your consideration. You know, you were charged with looking at this from the kind of a broader community perspective and to be independent in your judgment without respect to, you know, where current elected officials might reside or live, or where potential candidates in 2023, for example, might reside. Your charge also from the council was to complete your work by June 28th at the latest. So I think we have plenty of time to accomplish that, but that's not far away. So it's 6 or 7 weeks perhaps. So I think the committee's made great progress to date, and I'm sure the committee will continue to make refinements as you proceed to a final work product. But I think you're well on track, but the due date for your assignment is June 28th at the latest. Sooner is always acceptable too, of course. Once the council, so I want to kind of reinforce the importance of the work this committee is doing, because the way the ordinance is crafted, and this is directly related to the fact that the city council and the mayor wanted this group to act independently. The way the ordinance is crafted is, once you transmit your plan to the city council, they really just have 2 choices. They can, if the plan complies with state law, with Idaho Code Section 5707A, if it complies with the law, they are essentially required to approve the plan as submitted. The other option is, if they make a finding that the proposed plan does not comply with state law, their option is to remand the plan back to this committee for additional work and to make corrections as needed. So really, the council just has 2 choices. They can say, yep, you did it right, and we will adopt it, or you made a mistake somehow, and we're going to send it back to you to fix it. So those are the 2 choices of the council. And I mentioned that the plan goes into effect for the first time in terms of an election scenario in 2023, November of 2023. But the city council and the mayor were really mindful of the fact they wanted to have the rules of the land laid out as well in advance as possible, so that incumbents can make decisions about what they may want to do and may or may not want to do in 2023, and potential candidates, other candidates for office, can do the same. So the idea was to have the map and the districting plan in place at least 1 year prior to the filing period for the 2023 elections, so that everybody knows what the lay of the land is and everybody can make their decisions accordingly. So that also is part of the thought process. I want to just briefly talk about legal considerations, and then I'm going to wrap up and turn it over to Doug and to Brian and others, and Trent as well. So with regard, there's a hierarchy. We talked about this, but I'm going to summarize it again, perhaps for the public's information in particular, but a good refresher. So there's a hierarchy in the law, and that hierarchy is as follows. So first and foremost is the United States Constitution. Constitution trumps everything else, right? If there's a requirement in the U.S. Constitution, that trumps the Idaho Constitution, that trumps state law, and it trumps city ordinances. So with respect to the U.S. Constitution, we've talked about the 1 person, 1 vote rule or holding from the U.S. Supreme Court and other appellate courts that essentially says, under the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, in order to comply or to adhere to the Equal Protection Clause, and as a general rule, It's one person, one vote. And so with regard to districting, you can't have such a deviation in population amongst districts that we throw that one vote, one person, one vote rule out of kilter. And so the U.S. Supreme Court, the Idaho Supreme Court, and other appellate courts have held that I don't know, there's nothing magic about this number. It's what the court came up with. But they basically have ruled and held that if the deviation between districts is 10% or greater, there is a presumption that there's discrimination, that there's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And it's the burden is on the government agency to prove that is not the case. So our goal is to stay below 10% if we can, to avoid that legal presumption and potential challenge. And I think the plans that you all are focused on now accomplish that. So I don't envision that being a problem. But certainly a goal is to be mindful of that 10% threshold, so to speak. And we're going to try to stay below that to avoid any potential issues with the Equal Protection Clause. Part two, the next layer in that hierarchy is Idaho state constitution. The Constitution really doesn't have any explicit language on city council districts. There is language that talks about legislative districts and redistricting. There is no explicit language that deals with city council districts. So I think we're good there, but we need to be mindful that the Idaho Constitution is applicable here as well, and I don't envision that being an issue or problem. The next layer of your legal considerations is state law, which is the Idaho Code Section 5707A. So that's the provision that we've discussed previously as well, and I mentioned already several times here. So there are two things I want to point out that is in that state law. So one is there's verbiage that basically says each city council district shall consist of one or more contiguous election precincts. And so as we've discussed, you can, there are lots of smart people out there that can parse language and so forth, but I think the most logical interpretation of that language is that we need to use whole election precincts as established by Ada County, and just recently this year after the election, after the census data became available. So as you know, we've been working with that premise, under that premise that we're going to use whole election precincts to create the districts. Those precincts are not determined by the city of Meridian. Those are determined by Ada County based upon their criteria, and form a nice, I like to think about it as they form nice building blocks for the districts that you all are charged with creating. The other important aspect of state law is a requirement that states that each of the districts we're talking about, each district shall, to the nearest extent possible, contain the same number of people. That's very consistent with the Equal Protection Clause. That's exactly what the one person, one vote language is referring to. And so as we've talked about, there's a little bit of flexibility there because it doesn't say that they shall be equal. It says to the extent possible. So there's a little bit of wiggle room, but I don't want to overstate that. It's not that much wiggle room. So we need to be mindful of that. And then the last thing I'll say on the legal requirements is we have the ordinance that the city of Meridian has adopted that also talks about many of these issues. And so in addition to everything else I described, the local ordinance says that this committee will also look at principles of districting as they are or may be established by law, policy, and custom. So that's not language found in state law. That's language that's specific to Meridian that talks about districting principles established by law, policy, custom. So that would include things like, communities of interest, neighborhoods, some things that you've all talked about before. I think that all falls within that provision within the municipal ordinance. And I'll just reinforce, however, that we had the hierarchy. So you have to be able to check the boxes at the legal requirements that are that trump or are superior to local law. We need to check all those boxes before we get to that category. So all these things work together. It all kind of forms the basic framework for your decision-making authority. But those are kind of that's a brief overview of the legal lay of the land. So with that, I'm happy to stand for questions, or we can transition to a description of the maps that have been generated to date.
Thank you, Kurt. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, at this time, I will open the public hearing on the proposed districting map. We'll begin by asking the staff to describe the proposed map in 6 city council districts.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen here. May I ask, would you like me to run through the whole explanation of all of the steps for this hearing, or would you like me to just describe the map, the proposed map at the end?
Just, I guess, for viewers who haven't been part of it, you could probably go through the process.
Okay. All right, so Kurt already covered the law, but the detail here that's important is that our ordinance specified that we use the 2020 census information. And so we began with the area designated by the census as the city of Meridian. So not our current city limits boundaries. And that population designated by them was 117,635. We then selected the census blocks that were within that area and verified that population, by summing those census blocks, also equaled the population we were expecting. Then noting that we needed to use precinct boundaries and that the precinct boundaries mostly align with census blocks, but that some of them were split by the precinct boundaries. We had to use a map method where we generate a point of the center of each census block. And then we took those points and assigned them to whichever precinct they were in. And sometimes this means that all of the population of a particular block is assigned to one precinct, and so one precinct may miss out on a few. Those were all, let's see here. This map shows the census blocks that were split by precincts. And just for a discussion, why not split the population of those blocks? There's a very tight methodology used by the Census Bureau on how they assign population. If we were trying to do that ourselves and repeat it with a new study, it would take a lot of time and be scrutinized. And so we basically just use this math method, which is highly used and somewhat well accepted. So with that explanation in place, the populations that were assigned to each precincts were used by the committee to group precincts and form their proposed districting plan, which is shown here. And many of the items discussed in their meetings included a feeling of those in the city who feel like they are a part of different portions of the city. And so the proposed map that you see here reflects their feeling of keeping certain groups of the city together and not lumping large areas around the outside or other areas that wouldn't feel very cohesive or in line with keeping neighborhoods together and things like that. So what we end up with is a District 1 that's in the northwest, above the freeway, mostly west of, what is this, Linder? And a District 2 that is in the north, above, I believe that's Eustic. And then a District 3 that is kind of in a more central area of the city. A District 4 being on the east and north of the freeway. And then a District 5 that is south of the freeway and on the east of the city. And then a District 6, which is mostly the southwest of the city, but not completely below the freeway, branching up just a little bit there. So that's as much explaining as I have to do there.
Thank you. For the benefit of the members of the public here this morning, and some of this may repeat what you just said, I wanted to share what led the committee to presenting the proposed map. Over the course of the last month, we have met to review proposed maps and consider different boundary options. Committee members were able to review potential map changes to see how the changes would affect the population variance. The committee felt strongly about district boundaries not dissecting neighborhoods, having more than one district south of I-84, looking at growth areas in the city, and keeping the district populations as close as possible. Would any of the committee members like to add to that? Okay, with that, Mr. Clerk, could you please call those who signed up to testify?
Madam Chair, I checked the back a few moments ago. It's a full house, as you can see, but no one signed up.
If there's anyone on Zoom who would like to provide comment,
Madam Chair, there is nobody in Zoom.
nobody on Zoom. Okay. Yes, you'll still have to state your name and address for public record.
Michael Hahn, 2134 East Summer Ridge Drive, Meridian. So, actually, I just had a question. I don't have a color version. Can you bring that color version back up on this? So out of curiosity, theoretically, right, if you guys adopt this, or if the city council adopts this, right, and we flip into next year in regards to elections for city council. So you have two city councilmen that are coming up for election that are in the same district. The green one, which is number 2, right? So I would assume that they either will have to run against each other, right? And then you have oh, well, thank you, sir. And then you have District 3, which is essentially open, so someone will run for that. And then you have District 5, which is also open. Someone will have to run in that. But then you have District 6, which has a sitting city councilman, actually 2 sitting city councilmen, one whose seat is up next year. So I guess question 1 is, in that district number 6, will the the sitting councilman, Jessica Peralt, will she be able to run or not? I don't think anybody can answer that.
They'll be able to go through when your time's done.
What was that?
We'll get all your questions and then.
Oh, okay. So that's question number 1. And then question number 2 is in section 2, you have 2 sitting councilmen who comprise the other 2 that our seats are up this next year. I'm assuming that they'll have to run against each other, and then you've got 2 other opens. So that's my questions right there.
Thank you.
Go sit back down and listen.
You can have a seat. Mr. Starman, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Mr. Hahn. So I will, let me preface my comments by repeating what I said a little bit earlier. To date, the committee has not looked at the residences of existing council members. So that's not been part of the consideration at all. But so I'm going to sort of answer the question in a more general kind of more generic or general type of answer, which is as follows. I mentioned earlier in my comments that the ordinance adopted by the council maintains staggered terms. And so in 2023, there are 3 seats that will be elected by district. Those are seats 1, 3, and 5. And then in 2025, the 3 remaining seats will be elected by district, and those are seats 2, 4, and 6. I'll add a footnote, which is if there's a vacancy during that time, a seat becomes vacant for whatever reason, then there may be other seats that come into play, but that's kind of speculative at this point. So right now, odd numbered seats are up in 2023, even numbered seats in 2025. And then with respect to how that might play out if there are two incumbents in a district, yes, they're both could choose to run. One may choose not to. It's certainly within their prerogative, the incumbent's prerogative, and with respect to candidates that don't currently serve in the council, their choice as well. So there's the ordinance and state law does not dictate any of that. It's up to each council member and or potential candidate to make the decision whether they wish to run or not.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Hahn? Yes, you may.
So when you say seats 1, 3, and 5, that's going to correspond to, let's say hypothetically, this map is adopted by city council, right? When you say 1, 3, and 5, you're looking at section 1, or actually district 1, district 3, and district 5, correct?
Madam Chair, would you like me to respond?
Yes, please.
So I'd answer it a little bit differently, see if this makes sense. What I would say is that we're kind of, they do correspond, but I think initially I want to make a distinction. We're talking about city council seats initially. So seat 1, seat 3, seat 5 are up for election in 23,
Right.
2023. In that election of 2023, those seats will be elected by those districts that correspond to those numbers. So seat 1 will be correspond to District 1 and so forth.
All right. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the room that would like to provide comment on the proposed map? Okay, committee, at this time, do you have comments on the map that you would like to include in the record? Okay, so committee, based on feedback received, would you like to discuss any changes to the proposed map prior to the publication of the notice for the second public hearing?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Corey.
I would like to go on the record as saying that I have a concern on the option 1 map that in that the District 6 goes all the way from Hubbard Road across Cherry Lane. I do not have a proposal for how to fix that at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. Would anyone like to add to that?
Madam Chair,
Thank you, Commissioner Larson.
I appreciate Member Corey's concerns, and as we recall from our exercise in trying to do this, it is quite difficult, given the population sizes of the various precincts, to make the ideal map that still meets the population requirements. I am pleased with this proposed map as it being as good as it can be to meet all of the requirements, same size population, keeping the precincts whole, and then also keeping those neighborhoods together to the extent possible. And I would just also note that, of course, these are 2020 population figures, and in our high growth area, they're already a little different.
Anyone else? I think I'll just follow with that.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Yes. Oh, yes.
a question for Mr. Starman. Based upon 2020 and the way this has been done, we've got an 8.89% variance in the preferred map. What happens in 10 years from now? In 2030, District 1 here balloons, and District, pick a number, shrinks for whatever reason. And then you've got a 34% variance between districts. Does the city redistrict again, or do you even know? And it's not pertinent to what we're voting on, but it's just the comments made a moment ago made me wonder, kind of then what?
Madam Chair, members of the committee. So we do look at a point in time that's by state law. So we look at now we're looking at the 2020 census figures, which are already quite dated, as committee members have alluded to. And so we're looking at those numbers when we do when the committee does this work and does this analysis. Those are the numbers that we need to focus upon. When the 2030 census numbers become available, which absent another pandemic or something crazy, it should be in 2031. It was delayed this last cycle because of the pandemic. But when those 2030 census numbers become available, the city and other entities as well, but the city of Meridian will have to redistrict at that point in time based on the 2030 numbers. And basically we will reapportion so that we strike a balance once again between the 6 districts. So, and the city and whatever process is used at that point in time, it could be simply making changes around the edge of current districts, or we can start with the blank. The city could start with a blank slate and just do it all again from scratch. So when the 2030 numbers come out, there's a lot of latitude how the districts get drawn at that point in time.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
and
Commissioner.
I
Larson.
would assume as well, Kurt or Trent, that the county would do the precincts over in 2030 as well.
Yeah, that's correct. The county has an obligation under state law as well to develop precincts after census data becomes available. And I asked Trent maybe to elaborate on when that happens and how that happens.
Yes, Madam Chair, that the exact same process that we've been through will happen in 2030. So you will have probably a lot more options based off growth as we redraw precincts as well, based off what I assume would be possibly changes to legislative districts within the county as well. So there will be a lot more options, and the puzzle pieces will probably be easier if the variances look like they would be outside of 10%.
Madam Chair, that just jogged another thought in response to the question is that really the way I visualize it, and this might not be technically accurate and Trent can correct me, but I kind of visualize it as sort of the 3 steps that lead to city council districts. So the first is statewide redistricting. That process occurs first. That's step 1. Step 2 is then Ada County will create precincts. Once those districting lines are known, the Ada County will create precincts and honor those new legislative boundaries. And then step 3 would be the city updating its city council district maps as well.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just it doesn't have anything to do with drawing the lines on this one. It just made me start thinking about how does this work in the future? And I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
That's correct. Okay, I guess this time, as all members of the public who wish to speak have had the opportunity, we will continue this public hearing to Thursday, June 9th at 6 p.m.
Madam Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Corey?
I would like to make a request just for the record.
Yes.
It's possible, let's say just as a hypothetical example, the particular district that we've got that has the highest population and the one that has the lowest population could be adjacent. And they may actually have one of our precinct blocks straddling that line. And just as kind of something I want to keep in mind is if the place where that particular census block got placed, if it puts in jeopardy the deviation that we've got. So I would appreciate it if the staff would go ahead and augment the map that we've got with the split precincts and identify where the geocenter is for those split precincts.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I will show those, the centroids is what they're called, of each census block on that map so that you can see where the population will be assigned.
Thank you.
So Madam Chair, I think where you were heading was to continue the hearing until a date certain. I'm gonna ask the city clerk, is that how you intended that to be? It's going to be, are we going to have 2 discrete public hearings or is it a continued public hearing?
It could be either way. We published, or we said we're having two hearings. So if you interpret that to be two separate public hearings, that's completely fine. It can be continued or new. Either way, we'll be publishing a new hearing notice for it and then publishing whatever is directed by the committee to publish.
Madam Chair, I think with that last sentence, I might just, I will defer to the chair and to the committee members. I think both ways, both methodologies work. I have a slight preference for just closing this hearing and opening a second public hearing on a date certain, because that's how the ordinance is crafted, is that you shall have two public hearings. So in order to technically check that box, I kind of like the idea of closing this hearing and having a second standalone hearing, but does that make sense?
Does anyone disagree with that? Makes perfect sense.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Nesmith,
I move that we close this public hearing.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
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 Meeting is adjourned.